Member for Page.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister inform the House about Australia's trade situation, especially in light of the recent US announcement on its export enhancement program for wheat?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker.
Order. Members of the Government.
Mr Speaker, in the last 9 years we've seen a vast increase in the volume of Australian exports to nearly 1/4 of total GDP, total output. That is, nearly a quarter of all we produce we now export, a 200% increase in the life of this government. A broadening of our export base, where manufactured exports and service exports have tripled in the last 9 years, where elaborately transformed manufactures are now our fastest growing export and which have quadrupled since the government came to office. A redirection of Australia's trade to lock us into the rapidly growing market of Asia has also been undertaken, with half of our merchandise exports now being sold in Asia and ASEAN and Japan now being our two largest export markets. In fact, Mr Speaker, I rely upon no one more than the Shadow Minister for Trade, who said this the other day, which I thought was a very nice ringing endorsement of the government. He said, while everyone is aware that Australia's growth in exports has been outstripping growth in imports in recent years, few are aware that the growth in exports of manufactured goods and the growth in exports of services have held their own in relation to imports. Indeed, manufactured products have grown at about twice the export growth rate of primary products by 15.7% per annum since 1984. He went on to say, it gets better, significantly, the area of greatest growth within the manufacture sectors has been in elaborately transformed manufactures, which have grown by 44% in the same period and presently earn around $7.3 billion per annum in export income for Australia. The average annual growth rate of ETMs is 17.2% compared with 14% for simply transformed manufactures. And clearly unprocessed commodities no longer dominate Australia's export profile. Well said, Andrew. Well said, Andrew. Now, the thing is, Mr Speaker, on our trade policy has not been one-dimensional, and in that policy we've not only sought to undertake bilateral changes in the GATT, but move towards regional trade arrangements, which I spoke of in the Asia 2010 speech I gave in July. And those bilateral arrangements are with Indonesia and Japan, where I'll be going shortly, Kuwait, the government of Kuwait and the Emir of Kuwait who I'm meeting today. The Minister for Trade is just back from Japan to talk with a Korean delegation, and I met the Korean Trade Minister yesterday. We've devised bilateral trade strategies in 27 key exports. There are currently 2 delegations of Australian officials negotiating bilateral goods and service trade issues in ASEAN countries. That's 2 delegations are out there at the moment. Now, Mr Speaker, I contrast that with the Leader of the Opposition's views, and I just remind you that he's now saying that we should basically move into a trade relationship by formally applying to join NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, lining up behind Chile and Mexico to join NAFTA. But in January this year, Mr Speaker, at the Perth Summer School, he had this very interesting thing to say. So maximum pressure on the GATT first, and anybody who flirts with the idea of bilateral trade deals is undermining what ought to be our main emphasis in terms of making headway in the GATT. That is, views which are expressly and diametrically opposed to the view he's now putting just 8 months ago. So maximum pressure on the GATT first, and then he says anyone who flirts with the idea of bilateral trade deals is undermining what ought to be our main emphasis in terms of making headway in the GATT. Now, Mr Speaker, so last week's little somersault, policy on the run, if ever you've seen it, about one of the most important things ever, that is focusing the nation's strategic directions for trade, policy on the run, basically to camouflage a bit blue with the National Party over tariffs on sugar in Queensland. The sole point of it, he turns over a policy view he put in a structured speech in Perth just 8 months ago, and let's not say things have changed in 8 months with great trade arrangements in 8 months. He's turned it on its head. We're now about to join NAFTA, and I noticed that Professor Richard Snape made the point that we would get nothing on sugar, beef, dairy or wheat in NAFTA, where special protection of agriculture still exists, but we'd eliminate protection on motor vehicles and general manufacturing. So cars into South Australia from Mexico and other places, while we get no special benefit on sugar, beef, dairy or wheat. And that's obvious, is it not, Mr Speaker, from the fact that the Canadian Trade Minister is today speaking to our Trade Minister about the very problem of the eat. Now, Mr Speaker, this is the country where they say is the #1 trade enemy, but where they then line up to join it. His response is to enter an arrangement where we get nothing on wheat, nothing on sugar, nothing on beef, but wipe out our car industry. We do that, and we line up and sign up with their declared #1 trade enemy. Now, Mr Speaker, and of course, need I say, the Leader of the National Party's performance on this issue on Lateline last night was indecipherable. I'm not making a complaint about bias. It was just simply incompetent, simply babbling incompetence. And to think that this person would be the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia in a coalition government, I hope everybody interested in this issue was watching that program for the sheer paucity of view and the total confusion of mind which we saw. Now, Mr Speaker, in contrast to the opposition, the government acted with strength and sense to last week's announcements. I instructed my office to make our objections known before the announcement was made. We announced our strong objection as soon as the US program was released, and within 24 hours we notified our intention to proceed to formal complaints under the relevant GATT procedures. Now, Mr Speaker, the opposition said I should telephone President Bush, as if everything's handled on the telephone. You have a problem, pick up the telephone. Well, the fact is, Mr Speaker, Mr Bush wrote to me over the weekend about the EAP announcement, and I've of course replied, reiterating our objections and informing the President that we are taking action within the GATT against the agricultural export subsidy programs of both the United States and the European Commission. But, Mr Speaker, that is a proper process where the President's written to me about our views and I've responded, putting our views firmly and telling him what course of action we'll take. But this knee-jerk reaction that we should join NAFTA while the Leader of the National Party says that they are trade enemy #1, and then this attack on Japan, our biggest trading partner, where the Leader of the Opposition said last night on the 7:30 report the trade surplus is irrelevant. The trade surplus of $6 billion in a trade of $14 billion is irrelevant, he said. And he says we should toughen it up on Japan, he says, by eliminating our motor vehicle tariffs to take them to zero so the Japanese can stream cars into Australia at will, and by eliminating tariff protection for sugar and other products so other people around the world can stream their products into this economy. But the notion of a leader of a major party upbraiding our largest trading partner, who's given us large and continuing access over a quarter of a century to its markets, for which has produced a huge trade surplus with us, to have them upbraided in a doorstop interview in response to pressure from the country party about sugar tariffs, and then seek off the cuff to sign Australia up to the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement when the preponderance of our trade and its growth has been NAFTA, where the preponderance of our trade and growth has been in the Asia-Pacific area, is wanton and reckless and irresponsible in the extreme. And that's what we got from the Leader of the Opposition, knee-jerk policies from a party which has got no depth. And if the people want to be convinced about their lack of depth, they only had to look at the meanderings, the total confusion of the Leader of the National Party in that embarrassing performance last night. Mr. Speaker, it reminded me, as Kerry O'Brien was putting the body blows in, it reminded me of Muhammad Ali's phrase when he had somebody on the ropes. Rope-a-dope, he called it, rope-a-dope.
The